Hey guys, so today we're going to be looking at America's involvement in World War II. So let's just kind of recap what we've been looking at a little bit already. So we've looked at the timeline of escalation of the war in Europe with Hitler's invasion, or Hitler's rise to power in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, Tojo in Japan, and kind of seeing how they have progressed into starting this conquering of Europe, finally invading Poland, being the spark that kind of begins World War II. So America at this point, when Hitler invades Poland in 1936, America is, you got to remember, we're not too far removed. We're only shy of 30 years removed from World War I. It's a pretty recent memory for a lot of Americans. And like in World War I, America was really nervous about getting involved in Europe's affairs. We had seen World War I as America getting kind of entangled in something we had no business being in, and World War II was very similar. So a lot of people in America are really kind of pushing this isolationist idea. So what we're going to kind of get to see today is how America moves from this isolationist philosophy right up to being involved in the war. I also think it's important to remember where FDR's role in this is. So Franklin Roosevelt has just been reelected for his third presidency, the only president in our history to have more than 2 terms. So FDR would like to keep the nation as neutral and peaceful as possible. However, he also recognizes that that's probably not going to be something that we can do for long term, that it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to be completely isolationist. So he's going to kind of guide America through this as well. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So in 1934, a publication is released called The Merchants of Death. And The Merchants of Death makes these allegations that a lot of businesses, banks, and things like this were pushing a lot of money into World War I, which eventually got us involved in the war. This came out kind of as a scandal. A lot of people read this and it increased our isolationist feelings, and we're pretty unhappy with it. So much so that a senator called Nye, not Bill Nye the Science Guy, but a senator called Nye conducted a series of hearings for the next 2 years from 34 to 36 in order to investigate these claims, looking at some of the different industries that had been accused, including a lot of the banks. The idea was that this had kind of brought America into World War I, and this was something we were looking to avoid in the future. At the same time, in 1935, as Hitler is starting to get a little bit more noticeable in Europe, we pass a Neutrality Act. So this was an act passed through Congress that says that we are not going to sell weapons to nations at war. This again kind of comes back from that Merchants of Death thing. So the idea that this is the first Neutrality Act should let you know that there is more than one. So that's in 1935. In 1936, we passed the second Neutrality Act. This says not only can we not sell weapons, we also are not going to loan money. Okay? So this is something we had kind of done a little bit in World War I. But what we're going to be doing here is trying to keep ourselves out of this. In 1937, okay, so this is just as Hitler is really kind of taking control, America says that we are going to remain neutral in the Spanish Civil War. So remember, the Spanish Civil War was a conflict between the nationalists who supported the Spanish monarchy and the socialists who supported Franco, who was a fascist leader. Officially, America was going to stay out of it. However, a lot of American men did end up volunteering, but America was officially neutral through this. So these 3 acts really kind of show how we don't want to be involved, right? No money, no weapons, no say in your conflicts. That's not us, right? We're staying completely out of this. Now, FDR does, around this time, in one of his fireside chats, starts to talk to the American people, and he says this really famous quote, which I think is really important to remember. He says, "Let no man or woman thoughtlessly or falsely talk of America sending its armies into European fields." We're not sending our men to Europe. This nation will remain a neutral nation. But I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. I have said it not once but many times that I have seen war and I hate war, and as long as it is in my power to prevent, there will be no blackout of peace in the United States. So this just kind of shows 2 things here. One, that FDR does want to remain neutral as long as possible, but however, he says you can't ignore this problem, right? You can't remain neutral in thought, in the sense that you have to recognize that something is going on, and for as long as it is in my power, we're going to stay at peace. but recognize that may not be forever, right? In 1938, in October of that year, FDR asked Congress for $300 million to be put towards defense spending. So to start building up the Navy, start building up the Army, right? Also that year, Germany recalls their ambassador to the United States. So this would have been Hitler's ambassador to us. This is usually something that you don't do unless you think that you're going to be going to war with someone. You don't recall your ambassador. So that's kind of a sign that Germany is prepping for this. We also begin a program to build about 10,000 planes. This is a lot of money that's going towards defense right here in 1938. 1939, we begin what is known as the cash and carry policy. So this says that, all right, if you want to buy supplies from us, what you have to do is you have to pay cash and transport it yourself. So if you want to buy weapons from the United States, you have to pay us up front for them. We're not going to take it on credit, right? And you have to send a ship to the United States, pick it up, and bring it back home to you. Now, this goes against that Neutrality Act that we first had said, right? So the cash and carry policy is the first act that really goes blatantly against the Neutrality Act that we had passed just a few years before. It is important to remember, however, the Cash and Carry Act was not specific to the Allies. It was also, if Germany wanted to buy money from us, then they could do that as well. So that's important to keep in mind. These are just a couple other quotes here as the war is starting to heat up with the invasion of Poland. FDR says, "No man can tame a tiger into a kitten by stroking it." This refers to the appeasement policy, saying we're not going to be taming Hitler just by saying, "Oh, good kitty," right? Churchill, who's the Prime Minister of Great Britain, says if Hitler invaded hell, Britain would work with the devil in order to stop him. FDR and Churchill are going to go on to become pretty strong allies, so you can see how they are feeling about appeasement and about Hitler here. 1940. For the first time ever, the United States passes a peacetime draft law to draft soldiers into the military when we are not at war. What does this tell you? It should tell you that we're prepping for a war, right? That's what this is saying. Beginning of 1941, we changed the cash and carry policy into the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act says we are going to loan you weapons in return for the ability to lease your naval bases, right? So if we want to take our Navy to your naval bases, we are allowed to do so. You can see how this is also different from the cash and carry policy in the sense that we are loaning it, right? Why would we be doing this? Well, because by 1941, Great Britain didn't have any money, right? They're in the middle of a war. They can't afford to buy weapons with cash anymore. At this point, too, we are also focusing specifically on the Allies. So we're not selling money to Germany, selling weapons to Germany anymore, which pretty much just says what side we're on at this point, right? Also in 1941, when Japan invades some islands in the Pacific, we decide to cut off trade with Japan. This is a big deal because Japan got a lot of their oil from us, okay? So a lot of times that you'll hear that that Japan brought us into the war because they wanted to, right? That's not what they wanted. They didn't want another person to have to fight in this war. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor not to bring us in, but in the hopes that it would cripple us enough that they would be able to take our oil reserves in the Philippines, okay? So it begins when we cut off trade with them in July, okay? We cut off trade with Japan, and not long after that, we start to kind of make some deals, all right? The first thing that we do is sign the Atlantic Charter with Winston Churchill. So this is in August, right? So just a month after we cut off trade with Japan. Basically, FDR and Churchill meet in secret off the coast of Canada on a boat. That's where it's called the Atlantic Charter. And they come up with an agreement on if the U.S. gets involved in World War II, what do we want out of it, okay? So the Atlantic Charter is basically right here saying we're going to eventually get involved in this war. We recognize that. So we want to let you know up front what we want out of it. So if you look at this here, this is just some of the things that were involved in the Atlantic Charter. No territorial gains are going to be sought by the U.S. or the United Kingdom. Territorial adjustments must be made in accord to the wishes of the people concerned. So at the end of the war, when we start drawing new borders, the people have to be have a say. All people have the right to self-determination. Trade barriers are going to be lowered. There's going to be global economic cooperation and the advancement of social welfare. We're going to try and enforce freedom of want and fear. We're going to talk more about what that means in a little bit. Talk about freedom of the seas, so people can trade freely on the open seas. And that there is going to be a post-war disarmament and international organization. So this is similar to the League of Nations. So if you look at what these are all about here, this is basically trying to stop the same problems that we had at the end of World War I. So at the end of World War I, there were a lot of issues, right, that ended up causing World War II. This is kind of saying we are going to avoid that this time, right? But again, by making U.S. aims that are saying this is what we want out of this war, that's not saying if we get involved, that's saying when we get involved, right? So right after that, so that was in August, in November, the Japanese leader Tojo sends a peace envoy to Washington, D.C. to try and negotiate some plans with the U.S. government about whether or not we are going to be able to resume trade. Okay, so look at this. This is in November, right? Well, in December, we all know what happens. On December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. Oahu is bombed by Japanese planes. This is a big deal, okay? The attack on Pearl Harbor was very much planned weeks in advance, maybe even months in advance. It was a surprise attack while there were peace envoys in Washington, D.C., right? This is kind of the last straw, as you can imagine. There was a movie, Tora, 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 that came out in the 40s, I think, where this quote comes from this movie where it says, we have awoken a sleeping giant. The Japanese leaders never actually said that, but that's kind of what happened. By attacking Pearl Harbor, we're really going to get involved in this war. We take it as a personal offense, as it was. Thousands of Americans are killed, and this is the last straw. So we're going to continue kind of taking a look at this here. So that's where we will pick up. All right.